I'm here with Steve Metcalf. Hi, Steve.
Hey,
how are you? Good to see you.
Great to see you. I'm good. Yeah.
And Laynie Browne.
Hi there.
We are here at Julius Forstmann's summer home from the early 20th century, sometimes called the Castle, with the beautiful stone structures from the Neversink River. And we're here at Frost Valley, which anyone can find at frostvalley.org. It's a non-profit place. It's a camping and conference center. And we're here to talk about Robert Frost. And we have a poem called The Ovenbird we're going to talk about. And so I wonder if we could start by having Laynie read the poem.
Sure. The Ovenbird. There is a singer everyone has heard, loud a midsummer and a midwood bird, who makes the solid tree trunk sound again. He says that leaves are old, and that for flowers midsummer is to spring as 1 to 10. He says the early petal fall is past, when pear and cherry bloom went down in the showers. On sunny days a moment overcast, and comes that other fall we name the fall. He says the highway dust is over all. The bird would cease and be as other birds, but that he knows in singing not to sing. The question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing.
That's lovely. Thank you. Midwood bird. What is? Is that a term, or is that just Frost making it up?
Well, I went to the internet not knowing what an ovenbird was and came away with some nice factoids, one of which is in fact a midwood bird. It tends to nest very deep in large forests.
So midwood is not mid, it's like deep in.
Yeah.
In the middle of the woods.
I
In
think
the middle of the woods.
Yeah,
as opposed to
on the edge,
edges.
you might not.
Okay, a lot of birds like edges. This one likes to be way deep. I guess that's significant to the meaning of the poem.
Extremely.
Yeah.
Bird.
It's a deep bird, a deep in bird. Okay, it strikes me that it's wrong to talk about a bird and bird song here at a mansion built by
Gilded
a
Age mansion.
German magnate when we're really proximate to some serious midwood. So I say we should reconvene in the middle of the woods and finish this conversation. Yeah?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it.
Love it.
Let's talk about the first 3 lines. I'll say them, and I would love it for the two of you to situate us. There is a singer everyone has heard, loud, a midsummer, and a midwood bird who makes the solid tree trunks sound again. So we started to talk about midwood. Let's go a little further. So the location, Steve?
Well, it's in the, I would assume, the middle of whatever wood we're talking about, though I think there's already an interesting sort of teasing contradiction right up front, which is if this is a bird, and as I understand it, the ovenbird actually is a bird that you need to go deep into a wood to hear, it's sort of a little bit edge wary. And how has everyone heard it? I think the poem, you can glide past that very quickly because it's a very pleasant, teasing, Frostian opening, but it already has something very complicated working at the heart of it.
Laynie, I just love what Steve just said, and it puts me in mind of 2 things. Not only, as Steve said, that we have to wonder, it causes us to be just a little quizzical about where we are. If everyone's heard it, does that mean everybody's gone deep into the woods? Less likely that that's the case. The other thing is this kind of classic literary opening, kind of a version of Milton saying, okay, I'm ready to sing this poem, or sit down around me, young children, and I'll tell you about a story you've not heard before. There's this kind of warm-up. There is a singer everyone has heard, even though it's putting its off on the singer. The bird, the singer is also the singer of poem songs.
Yeah.
Right, so there's already a confusion, a slight confusion.
So bird as poet, perhaps.
Bird as poet, perhaps,
one
right
way to read
away.
it. Frost, or other poets, or poets in general.
Okay.
All that.
On the 3rd line, Steve, who makes the solid tree trunk sound again? That confused some of us, thinking maybe this is a bird that pecks against a tree, but it's not that. So how do you explain it if it's a singing bird that is not a going after insects inside the bark, how do we get the tree trunks involved?
It's sort of a wonderful misdirection. You definitely, I think most readers, not knowing what an ovenbird is, would think of that kind of echoey, impact, almost ballistic impact of the hard beak of a wood-boring bird,
Right.
echoing
Right.
through the forest. But of course, this is a poem entirely about song making,
Right.
so it can't be that. So it's funny. It's the solid tree trunks sound again, and I walked away from Google this morning with a lot of ovenbird trivia. And one thing I read is that, there is something like an abatement of birdsong after the height of spring and before the middle of summer. And one of the returns of birdsong is the ovenbird and other birds that begin to sing more.
And the abatement is
In the
only a
season.
matter of temperature and seasonality. It's just
I would assume it's
just what
somehow
happens.
answering the cycle of the earth.
Another
yeah.
thing is that I read about the ovenbird that it builds.
you all were doing your homework. I didn't read about the
It
other
builds
bird.
its nest, which resembles a Dutch oven, thus the name, entirely from the inside, so it's invisible.
And on
as-
the ground.
Wait,
right.
Sorry.
there's some references flowing
Yes.
past us. Dutch oven, explain that,
It's something you cook in, right? I mean, it's a sealed pot,
right?
and so the nest looks like it, and the bird weaves it from the inside as opposed from the outside. So the bird is invisible as it makes the nest. Thus, the trees are sounding. You can't see the bird. Maybe the bird is inside the nest, hidden from view.
This is remarkable. So, Steve, this is not only a bird that's way in the woods, which we don't come upon a lot unless you're really going to look for it or hear it, and doubly invisible because it's building its home inside presumably the little pieces of the woods that it's created for its nest, and invisible even if you go out there.
That sounds right to me.
So who's hiding here? What the heck?
It's a single integrated piece, the nest, that it weaves from
Oh,
the bottom
remarkable.
up.
Yeah, there's, getting at the theme of in Frost, happening upon something in the woods,
Is a thing.
unexpectedly, is just a motif that the woodpile, the birches, the notion of a person having been there who's absent but whose handiwork is somehow in the
Right,
landscape. Another big theme is whether or not the relationship between birdsong and meaning is big for him, because he regarded poetry. He had a theory of poetry, which is that in the same way that you can overhear a conversation through a closed door, not being able to make out the specific words, but by rhythm, cadence, and timbre, you understand what's happening in the conversation. He thought even semantically discernible speech had so much music to it, intrinsic music to it, that it was almost like a kind of human birdsong. And so there's getting back to the theme of surreptitiousness, the poem is about speaking a truth by not speaking a truth in some sense, being present but absent. So you hear this bird, you don't really see it. Its presence might be mysterious in the landscape.
And as an analogy to the poet, which is where we begin, right? Birds and poets singing. How does that work as an analogy to the poet? Does that mean the poet generates the song from some inner place that can't be seen? Is that the analogy? I'm just throwing that out there.
I had kind of a darker view of it, which is that there's a statement that the poet's art is not in the language, but in the music, and also knowing when to be silent and have empty space, or even to know I've written enough, I need to stop.
Which a sonnet would help you realize, by the way, after 14 lines.
Right.
We're now what's the word I'm trying? Entering into the conversation, the fact that this is not just a
Sonnet.
form that knows where it has to stop if it's going to be traditionally conforming, but it is a complicated one. It is the weaving of a single poetic strand into a nest that can be a home, and famously, in the history of at least English sonnets, an inside sufficient unto itself place, poetic place. How am I doing with any of that? Does that seem right?
Marvelously.
Yeah. It's great.
I would add also that maybe the last piece of trivia here that hopefully is useful to our reading is that when people try to describe to someone who hasn't heard it or doesn't know how to recognize
I
it,
know where you're going.
yeah, what the Ovenbird song is, it's teacher, teacher. This is common. You get multiple, you know, it's in anyone writing knowledgeably about the Ovenbird, they'll say that.
Right.
And this poem is saying something about a true kind of didacticism made out of the, you know,
Unbelievable.
the
Yeah.
meter making argument is somehow withdrawing the didacticism while also offering.
My gosh.
Yeah.
So are you
Teacher.
suggesting that, probably you're suggesting that Frost picked up on something that is well known about the song that is a pun on the English word teacher and learning, and is certainly burying it, because really you have to do some work to figure out that the song that everyone has heard.
He wrote a couple years before Google really became a thing. So
Right.
If you go to the ornithology lab online at Cornell, you can hear the sound of the ovenbird.
Maybe we should put
Add that.
with this video
Yes.
a link to the audio of the ovenbird
It's
saying
lovely.
teacher, teacher.
And you
So
can
let's
see it.
just stipulate that teacher is relevant, that teaching is relevant, that pedagogy is relevant. Now let's reinterpret the first line. We've all been talked to by a didact.
that's right. That's
You
right.
think that's what that means?
I mean, it's in there.
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
It's in there. Yeah.
We are doing stuff. All right, pause on all that fabulous meta stuff.
Yeah.
And let's just breeze through, as it were, the lines of the seasons. So we have this comparison between midsummer and spring. Summer, usually the poets, well, at least for Wallace Stevens, summer is the credence. It's everything. And for someone like William Carlos Williams, spring is everything, spring and all, because things are just coming to life. But anyway, the speaker here has a position on that, so does the bird. Then we get sunny days, and then we get autumn, I think, and comes that other fall we name the fall that is such a Frostian line. It makes me a little annoyed at Frost when he comes so perfectly iambic to say something you could say more easily about autumn. Okay, so we got
And
to autumn
Biblical fall.
and the biblical fall. Oh gosh. Sin, is there sin anywhere here?
All over it.
All over it. Okay, let's go with this. So I invited you to say something about the seasonal stuff that's being said here, but it's so obvious. Let's go right to the harder stuff.
Sure. Well, let's start with the easier, or let me start with the easier very quickly, which is that it's also classic for Frost in that it's a poem of displacement in a moment that seems very present in the woods hearing a bird, but it's actually about in midsummer having both a yearning for spring, which is innocent of the fall for coming so early.
Right.
And
And more
this-
beautiful because of all the petals and the
Right,
blossoms.
which aren't the fruit. It's not the fruit falling, it's the petals.
Right.
Exquisitely beautiful and without
Pear and
sin.
cherry blooms.
Right, it's almost prelapsarian. And
Yep.
then you have this memento mori, right? I mean, that's what the bird is telling you. It's like, here comes the other fall.
So that other fall implicitly refers to the first fall you think of, which is the
I think
fall
it's,
of man.
it's both. And we can get into what I think the poem is not ultimately about. There's no single commanding reading of it that in any way, nullifies any others. But I do think that there is a specific fall he might be alluding to in here.
Okay, go for it.
Well, so that mystery that I talked about in those first couple of lines about why, if this thing is buried deep in extensive woods, has everyone heard it? Because not everyone walks in the middle of woods. Well, I think the turning line in this poem, so a sonnet is an octet and a sestet with a turn, is the only line in the poem that is one sentence, complete sentence. Every other line is, it comes after. No, it's the only one that's a
He says
fully
the highway
complete
dust
sentence.
is overall.
Right. So it's not enjammed, begins with the subject
Yes.
and ends with a period, and is one line of poetry.
Yes.
He says the highway dust is overall.
Which is introducing a new concept here, a new topic.
car exhaust
Yeah.
is covering this wood. That,
Well, not just car exhaust. I'm sorry. I've spent a lot of time on country roads that are not paved. So it's the dust of the road
yeah.
that's pervades everything.
Yes.
Maybe car exhaust as well. But,
Yeah. I mean,
that means that this is not. We are not so far in that a road is not nearby.
Humans are encroaching on the territory.
And so that's why everyone has heard it. Because in fact, the woods are now so small, so compromised, so latticed through with the human presence that the edge and the middle are becoming indistinguishable.
Hark! I hear a car going by.
On cue.
We were pretending we were mid-wood, but in fact, we're close to the road.
Well, this is what Al can do with the $250,000 budget here. We've got a guy cue Corolla at that moment.
And somebody's on a radio.
Earpieces, PAs.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, there's no internet where we are, so at least we're that far away.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep going. I'm sorry. So there's something really significant being told to us about the setting and the scene and the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, Laynie, what should we do with that?
What
And
should we
he
do with that?
says, the bird seems to be singing. He says, who's he? He says, that's the bird.
Right.
So the bird is saying, oh, I want to teach you stuff about the way the seasons go. Summer is not so spring. Yeah. And I want to teach you about, there's a lot of teaching. What's the sound? Teacher. Yeah.
I think it's
and I want
about-
to teacher you about, I want to sing about the encroachment. I'm doomed.
Right.
I'm a goner.
I'm a
Right.
goner.
Yep.
Okay. Do something with that, please.
Well, the bird would cease to be as other birds, so the bird has to change. The bird has to adapt to survive, and the poet, writer of the poem, or the poet singer,
Yeah.
is also adapting to this new situation in which there is no mid-wood. Like, how do you, if you need the mid-wood to sing your song, whether you're a bird or a human, there is no.
So the bird either adapts,
or
as many birds have,
right,
or it goes
disappears.
extinct.
Right.
Somewhat, for example, like a poet born in Victorian America,
Somewhat
coming
like
of
that.
age in Georgian England, surrounded by the Georgian poets who are hearkening back in a very nostalgic way to a certain kind of nature and nature poem.
And then comes in contact with people like Ezra Pound.
Right, who then becomes in his own really covert way a modernist and brings 20th century speech into verse and becomes a mass market phenomenon and adapts.
You got it. So
He's not as
we
other
have
birds.
to read this.
He is definitely
He's
not as
not
other birds.
As other birds.
No,
Yeah.
they sell 4 copies
And what does
he
he
sells a
do
million.
to sing this particular song? He writes a sonnet. It is a rhymed sonnet. How's the rhyming going?
Well, it's not
odd, right?
It's not Shakespearean or Petrarchan.
But it's rhymed
it's
somewhat,
rhymed.
right? Can you go through it? A.
B, C,
Heard bird, again flowers.
B,
10 past.
D, D.
Showers
he says.
overcast. Fall all. There's
E,
a rhyme.
E, A,
Birds
F.
sing, words thing. So you've got a quatrain at the end.
Mhm.
So it's a modified sonnet, but it reads
Modified.
like a sonnet.
Right.
Wow, Steve. So Frost is the oven bird.
I think he is.
Yeah. And chooses to displace his song of morning, pre-morning, on the bird whom he calls he. And it's a bird that says teacher, 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 teacher.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
It's a lot
Who
there.
picked this poem?
You did.
It's a meta poem.
Yeah.
He's Al, you won't join me in this. You won't link hands with me midwood and agree that Frost is truly one of the great meta poets who ever lived.
I think, let's see, let's Laynie and I both think about that aloud.
Okay.
And then we'll do final thoughts on this poem.
All right.
Because, you know, frost is creeping in. It's 32 degrees here. We're recording this on April 2nd. And frost is getting me in the behind.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's cold.
We're sitting on a cold log that spent the entire winter waiting for someone to sit on
a
it.
couple of butt
Dupes,
cheeks. Yeah,
some dupes.
warm it up a little.
Warm it up.
Yeah,
Let
we're the
get the
suckers
sap,
here. Yeah.
sap flowing. I think what I want to say, of course, I adore you always, and I revere. I mean, we dragged you all the way here to the Catskills
Here I am.
to talk about frost because
Yeah.
you're the one. And we have this ongoing conversation about whether Frost fits into the kind of poetry and poetics that I admire or that Laynie admires, etc. So I guess my response to you is this. I think he needs to be a meta-poet because he's very competitive and he really knows his community, and he knows where he is an outlier. Spending that time in London, exposing himself to all the people who are doing all this this is not formally experimental, so formally experimental stuff, kind of expecting him to do the same, being interested, but then sticking to his New England colloquial Americana,
Right.
partly out of that ambition to be famous, because it's pretty hard to and you need to be meta if that's the case, because you're constantly conscious of your stance with respect to what other people are doing, and you want to say, you people think of yourselves as marginal and outsiders and avant-garde and cool and hip, but I am the one who's endangered. I am the one who's going to go extinct. So you have to be meta in order to say that.
I think there's a lot to that. Let me shade it in a couple of ways. The first is that the first two consequential people to believe in Frost, he showed his poetry to nobody. That's the wild thing. He's approaching 40, which is a different age in 1908 than it is in 2022. That's far into a human life very often. Not for Frost, because he lived forever, it turned out. But he finally shows his poetry to someone, and it's Edward Thomas, who then shows it to Ezra Pound. So not a couple of lightweights, and straddling both sides of the Atlantic, and two very different sensibilities too. And they both love it because they've never heard anything like it. The perception that Frost was doing something radically new has been lost to the reputation that he's accreted over the century plus since. But they'd never heard idiomatic American speech rendered both so obviously poetically as in The Death of the Hired Man, the poem that he gave to Thomas, and made poetic and conversational in that way at the same time. It's as radical as Hemingway, and we've lost the radicality of that too.
Also as radical as Wordsworth, by the way. Those guys back in the early 19th century were doing the same thing. Yeah.
And then the second point I was going to make is, I don't know how conscious he is of his, he was very competitive. So yes, in one sense, extremely, extremely conscious. To a psychopathic degree, he compared himself constantly to other poets and hated being upstaged in a way that was really unhealthy.
Right.
But I think it was also just, what's the poet's relationship to the marketplace, and are you willing to forsake it completely? So he had to be the oven bird in that sense. He had to sell something to a mass audience, which he did, which is a version of life before industrial modernity took it over, when Americanness could mean being self-sufficient and self-reliant in a really somewhat deep and meaningful way, if you were white and male, principally, one should say. But and he became famous over the progressive loss of that to the 20th century. And so in one sense, you could say, well, he's kind of like Thomas Kincaid in verse, right? He has these pictures of something that never really was, rural scenes of yesteryear, and he sells them as a kind of nostalgia factory to, American consumers who are increasingly living in suburbia and driving on highways, leaving their dust everywhere. At the same time, that's where I think, and that's the marketplace, that's where he has to be clever vis-a-vis Eliot and A.R. Ammons and, Wallace Stevens and on. So he hides modernism
like
and
the
radicality in other places.
Yeah, that's so well said. Thank you. Laynie, do you want to react, before we do final words, respond to this conversation that we're having about Steve saying, it's meta-poet every time. The I added.
It was there.
There, teacher, turning it on the teacher, and reminding us that Frost is more proximate to what's going on in the modern period than we like to think.
It's a good argument. There's definitely meta moments.
Yeah.
In the poem.
In the case of this poem, it's the whole poem is a meta moment, and the sonnetness of it is just meta, because it's saying, look, I'm not going to abandon this oven bird who sings a regular song.
And I wonder,
And I sing a regular song.
if this not being as other birds is he commenting on other poets that he's very competitive about?
I like that. Yeah.
Very possibly.
It's very Frost.
Yeah. Okay, final thoughts. Anything, you can go back to the phrasing or wording of the poem if you want, although I love where this conversation has gone more generally. Steve, you have a final thought?
I do have a final thought. Something came to me during this very, very edifying and very fun exercise, which is, it could also be a poem in some way about depression. In some sense, that's where we've all heard what happens deep, deep in the dark woods, in some sense, and that some of its universalizing power is in the middle of summer, right? Midsummer, like Earth's plenitude all around you.
Yes.
You can't help thinking about what's been lost and what's to be lost. And I think it's maybe that movement of the mind that is the hardness there.
Yeah.
And that's there whether or not there's an ecological, apocalypse on the horizon.
Yes, as long as there are seasons, there will be change, and change intellectually and maybe viscerally, biologically, we know is good, important. But in terms of high spirits and low spirits, change is bad. You really don't want to have to fall every year, especially if you live in a northern latitude or a southern latitude where the day really is different. And the summer is the one time when you think, I'm going to live forever.
Right. But if you hold too tightly to that presence is a form of violence to self and nature, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have to live in the change that's, inherent in it.
Yeah. Laynie, final thought?
Well, connecting to what you just said, then he says the highway dust is over all. I initially read that as, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. So it's a turn toward mortality. And then I would read the end as the birds ceasing to sing, as it's the end of a life. But I'm also really interested in this idea that the bird knows in singing not to sing, in that poetry is the song that persists, not the words on a page.
Wow, that was going to be my final thought, so I'm just going to add to it.
Okay.
I'm okay, I got the last line. I really do, thanks to you two. What to make of a diminished thing? Are you the kind of animate being on this earth, the way it's evolved, that's going to adapt to essentially climate change, right? Or human-induced climate change, roads and dust and proximity to places that are way, way out there and where animals have lived without humans for so long. So we know that all of us need to know what to make of diminished thing. The diminished thing being the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Right? And there are going to be some species that cannot and will not do it. The sonnet as a form is one of those things. I think you would disagree, actually, because you've made a lot of a diminished thing. So let me strike that from the record, because I think that's ridiculous. But I'm trying to think of Frost's imagining of a form that is so ovenbird-like that it really is threatened, and can't change. Okay. I mean, Laynie Browne has written so many. Daily Sonnets is a book of sonnets, which are experimental sonnets. So you're the wrong person to be standing here next to and saying, or sitting here next to.
The sonnet is going away.
The sonnet is going away.
No, but if sonnets are a part of the world, as poets and birds and trees and all of us are part of a world that's diminished by human action, then the sonnet is included in something that is going away if we're all going away.
That's right. Okay, good. Yeah. So what I started to say was, I got that last line, but then the two lines just prior to it, the ones you referred to, the bird would cease and be as other birds, but that he knows in singing not to sing, the question that he frames in all but words. I don't know entirely what to do with that, but I do know that he is referring to silence, to not singing, to refusing to sing, to not being able to sing anymore, and birdsong, which has always informed the idea of the poet. Keats most famously, maybe. There's a lot of roo-coo-cooing going on in Wallace Stevens. There is that whole tradition of it, romantic and post-romantic tradition of it. But this is different. that he knows in singing not to sing. That is a hard thing to ask of a bird that sings so beautifully.
Yeah.
The question that he frames in all but words.
Could it be that this idea that it's received, in other words, it's not the bird or the poet singing, it's receiving.
It's receiving, yeah.
From a source, as opposed
yes.
to being the author.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and it calls up the question. We're hearing ducks that are moving north.
Mm-hmm.
We're not, or geese. So we're not actually hearing any kind of birds in the woods here. But a question that one must ask is, why do birds sing? Why do birds sing? I'm thinking about a book by David Rothenberg, Why Birds Sing, who's a poet. And then there's the question of, or, why do cats meow? Oh, I just heard a bird.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is because they do.
Mm-hmm.
Why do humans act in a certain way? Because, let's face it, they do. They're wired to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, does the poet have to sing? And the answer is, of course.
Mm-hmm.
In all but words, teacher, teacher. Laynie Browne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Steve Metcalf, this was just more than wonderful.
Great. It really was.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
Thanks.
Yeah.